In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear God in heaven, please lead us through Ezra and Nehemiah today. Help us to see what your plan is and was, and help us to do your will as Ezra and Nehemiah did. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, let's hit the road. We will share screen and start out with Ezra and Nehemiah. We read both books, a lot of reading, but I think very interesting reading. So a little bit easier to read. As always, we start with the review. So creation, fall, flood, nations, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, redemption, revelation, sacrifice, sanctification, tribes, tragedy, transition, coverage, commands, covenant, conquest, settlement, cycles, love, Samuel, Saul, David, united, divided, divided, surviving. That's where we left off last week with this divided and surviving, right? The 12 tribes of Israel entered the promised land, but for a long time they really existed as just 12 separate tribes. But under the leadership of David, he united the 12 tribes into a single nation. And they stayed united under Solomon, but when Solomon died, they divided into north and south, right? Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Jeroboam was with the north, Israel with 10 tribes, and Judah remained with the Davidic kings down in the south. And that was under Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. And that was the first division. But then last week we heard about the other two divisions. The first came when the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria, and Assyria exported all the people, save some poor people. And then about a century and a half later, Judah falls. And Judah falls to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar exports everybody, very similar to what Assyria did. And they're surviving out there in the hinterlands, right? That's the diaspora. They're dispersed outside of the chosen land. Well, this week we read in Ezra first about the very first re-importation when the exile ends for the tribes of Israel. And it happens under Persian rulers. Remember that Jeremiah predicts that Isaiah predicts that under a king named Cyrus, that the exiles will be allowed to return to the promised land. And so I put down here a little timeline just to kind of, because there is a lot of history mixed into Ezra and Nehemiah. And when I say mixed, sometimes they're not in chronological order. And so what I did was I put down who the rulers were of Persia. So it starts out with Cyrus. He is going to be the one who allows the temple to begin, to allow the exiles to first go back. The second ruler in between Cyrus and Darius, we don't hear about at all in scripture. Then Darius takes command for 36 years. Xerxes the first for 20 years, then Artaxerxes for 41 years. And that's when Ezra and Nehemiah come into it, right? The temple is begun under Cyrus. It's finished under Darius. Ezra and Nehemiah, and I put probably with Ezra, there's a little bit of scholarly debate, right? There are two Artaxerxes. There's the Artaxerxes the first and Artaxerxes the second. Nehemiah definitely ties himself to Artaxerxes the first, but Ezra, there's no clear year dating within his memoirs and his writings. Um, so that's kind of the timeline where the temple is begun, where it's finished. Ezra is going to reintroduce the law, the Torah, Moses' law. Nehemiah is going to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so that's what it looks like on a timeline. And a little bit just about the writing of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's believed that those two books were written by the same author, the chronicler. He wrote First and Second Chronicles, right? We read First Samuel and Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings, and after those two books, there's a First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, which we did not read, but is kind of a repetition of the 4 books previous to it. But it's written by a different author, the chronicler. The chronicler is very interested in the history of Judah and Israel, and he is very interested in genealogy. And you see that come out in these 2 books. So in Ezra, chapters 1 through 6, the exile ends. God charges King Cyrus of Persia to build him a house in Jerusalem, which I find very, very interesting, that God works outside of the Hebrews, right? King Cyrus is a pagan, but he hears the word of the Lord and he responds to it, right? He wants blessings from this God of Jerusalem. Being a pagan, he still views him as a territorial God, but a very powerful one. And he is more than willing to build that house in Jerusalem for him. And what he does is he opens it up to those who want to freely go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple of God. Well, one of the people who wants to go back is Zerubbabel, and he is the last Davidic descendant mentioned in the Old Testament. He helps lead the sons of Israel back to the promised land and build the temple along with somebody named Sheshbazzar, right? Sheshbazzar is picked by King Cyrus to be the governor in Jerusalem. And so between him and Zerubbabel, they are going to get the temple rebuilt. But it takes a long time because the foreigners that are transplanted by Assyria oppose it, and the Israelites are distracted by their own desires and indifference. Now, you don't really read about the Israelites being distracted by their own desires and indifference. But if you go back to the 2 prophets of this time, Haggai and Zechariah, and you read their prophecies back in the prophetic books, you will see that, again, it's the sins of Israel's tribes themselves that are really tying up the building of the temple, along with this foreigner interference. Right? When the 12 tribes are kicked out of the chosen land, other foreigners are brought in to settle the land, and they build their homes, they make their families there. And now all of a sudden, you have the previous tenants coming back into the land. And as you can imagine, the foreigners are not very happy about it. And what they do in the beginning is they try to write letters to various kings. Now, one of the things that Jeff Cavins actually points out to us in when you have a timeline like this, you can see it. The letters are not always in the right chronological order. So in chapter 4 of Ezra, we actually see a letter that gets written to Artaxerxes. that's the first letter that we see where foreigners write back to him and say, hey, they're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. You know, this was a hostile land or people, and they're gonna wanna, you know, we don't think that you should let them do this. And Artaxerxes writes back to him and says, yeah, I think you're right. I don't, and tell them to cease building. And it happens for a small amount of time. But what they do is go back in the archives and they find the letter from Cyrus, that the decree that's actually written, right? Persia, you can see, is this tremendous bureaucracy. Kind of reminds me of our government. You know, I used to work for the government. Yeah, it did everything in triplicate. And you were always told, like when I was in the Navy, you were always told, you know, keep a copy of this until you die, because someday you will be asked for it again. And even though it's supposed to be in the archives, they won't be able to find it. I still have all my Navy records, right? And the same was true. Lots of copies of everything going to different places. Well, the same thing happened in Persia. When these foreigners oppose the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the walls, they go back to their archives and they find the letter from Cyrus that says it's go for it. So there's one letter that's written about the walls of Jerusalem. It happens to be the first letter that we see. And then a second letter gets written in here when they're actually rebuilding the temple, and the foreigners go to the Jews that are rebuilding, and they ask them, you know, wait, what's your name? You know, who are these people? Because we're going to write it in a letter back to the king. And but it turns out that the kings support, you know, Cyrus. They're in line with him. And so the prophets Haggai and Zechariah help get Israel back on task, right? They're part of this divine council. The Lord is speaking through them, and they get the attention of the 12 tribes of Israel, again, those who have come back, and we read the genealogies of the families that have come back, and they get them back on task to finish the temple. And we read about the dedication of the temple and how the Passover is celebrated. But the one thing we don't read about is that the Lord's glory does not return to it, right? Ezekiel, the prophet, before Babylon destroyed the temple, he saw a vision of the glory of God leaving the temple. And now we see the 12 tribes returning to Israel, a small group of them, and rebuilding the temple. And of course, it's not the Temple of Solomon. When we read in chapter 1 and 6 about this temple and the foundation that gets laid, the people who actually knew what Solomon's temple looked like, they wept, because this new temple is so much smaller. It's not going to be magnificent like the last one. And even though it's funded by Cyrus, and even though he's going to return the holy vessels that were stolen by Babylon when they took the land, it's just not going to measure up. And there's no report of God's glory returning to it when they finish it in 515 BC. So that's chapter 1 through 6, how the temple gets built with the help of first King Cyrus and then King Darius of Persia. And then in chapter 7, we read about Ezra getting his commission. Now, Ezra is a descendant of Aaron, and he sets his heart on teaching the law of the Lord, the Torah, in Israel. And he lets the king of Persia know that this is his desire. And the king of Persia is more than cooperative. He lets him take those who want to go with him. He funds him. He says, waives the tributes on the religious. He makes Ezra the appointer of judges. He said, you know, anybody who's not cooperating with them, you can judge them. You can use anything from the death penalty to, you know, exiling them, to also any kind of punishment that you deem appropriate for whatever they do. But yes, you take a group and you go back and you teach the law to these people in Jerusalem. They've rebuilt the temple, but they're not living to the law. And this is kind of an interesting picture here. It's a relief of Artaxerxes the First from his tomb where he is buried. And there are other reliefs of him too. But here in Ezra and Nehemiah, we are dealing with actual kings of Persia, with actual history of the world, as we do in the whole Bible. But now we have some hardcore archaeological evidence of the kings that they were dealing with. So Artaxerxes does something else too. He warns off all these foreigners who are writing letters, you know, and saying, you know, don't let them rebuild. And he makes it clear that when Ezra comes to teach the law, that he better be getting cooperation, he better be getting money from these foreign governments. And I love, you know, you think of the Persian kings as, you know, oh, these are really nice guys. But he tells the foreigners, you know, if any of you messes with what I have going on here, I want to pull a wooden beam out of your own house and I'll have you impaled on it. And then we'll take all sorts of retribution actions against your family. And so you can see that it's still a very, very violent land that Israel is living in. So Ezra goes off to Jerusalem. He's allowed to see who else freely wants to go with him. He can't force anybody to go, but he can get volunteers. And one of the amazing things about Ezra that's really noteworthy about him is his total trust and devotion to the Lord. He trusts that God is going to send with him worthy Levites, right? He goes out and he gathers together all these people from the tribes of Judah and from Israel. And when he looks out at them, though, he notices there are no Levites. And so what does he do? He prays. He prays to God. And he sends somebody off to where the Levites live. And they bring back to him very, very trustworthy Levites, right? The Levites are the ones who deal with all of the holy items, holy vessels. They are like the workhorses within the temple. You have the priests, and to be a priest, you have to be a descendant of Aaron. And then you have the Levites, those who are charged with actually handling holy items. So he trusts God. He prays, he trusts God. When he gets the whole group together and they're ready to start their journey, the first thing he does is he proclaims a fast, right? And Ezra is very, very aware of the fact that the reason that Assyria and Babylon were allowed to exile the chosen people was because the chosen people did not live up to their covenant with Yahweh. Yahweh had told Moses that if you're faithful to me, then you will live in this land. But if you do not live up to the covenant that I have made with you, if you don't live by my statutes and my commandments, then I will disperse you. And Ezra is very, very aware of that. So he starts out this trip by proclaiming a fast, by asking for mercy from God for all the sins that Israel has committed. He refuses to ask the king of Persia to give him any soldiers to protect him, even though they're going to be carrying back all of these valuable vessels and lots of gold and silver. He knows that this is a mission from God, and that he's got to place total trust in God, and that's what he does. And God protects them without the help of the king of Persia. He shows his trust and his devotion by trusting the priests to carry the riches. And he gives a very beautiful speech to them about their own holiness and about the holiness of the vessels that they'll be carrying, and why they must be so careful with them. And right, these people who are returning with Ezra are not going into a friendly place. And so they are really the creme de la creme, right? They know that martyrdom may await them when they return to Jerusalem, but the temple is there. The Israelites that have already returned, and when I use the word Israelite, we're talking about people from both the northern and southern kingdoms that are returning there. So the other thing that is really notable is when he goes to offer sacrifices when they arrive in Jerusalem. There's bulls and lambs, and then there's 12 he goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. Ezra again working to reunite, like David did, these disparate tribes that had broken themselves into two nations. Now that they're coming back to Jerusalem, right? Now that they're coming back to Judah and to portions of the Holy Land, they need to be one again. In chapters 9 and 10, he talks about no intermarriage. He prays, again, expressing the guilt of Israel and not living out their covenant, and points out again and again how merciful God is, that God could have totally destroyed Israel and Judah, but he has not. He's kept this remnant alive, and now he's returning the remnant to Israel. And the people weep with him when he reads them the law, and he tells them that this was one of the huge sins of the former inhabitants of this land, who were supposed to be under this covenant with Yahweh, that they took these foreign wives and then they started practicing religions that were foreign to God. And so when the people hear about it, they're like, oh, we've done it again. And they agree with him to put away their foreign wives. There were a couple of priests who didn't agree with it, who are called out by name, and a couple of Levites who support them. But other than that, they decide it is better. If we're going to keep our covenant this time with Yahweh, we really have got to put away these foreign wives and foreign children. And even though Ezra has now reintroduced the Torah, the law, to the people, there's still something missing. And you really see that in Ezra chapter 9, verse 7. It says, from the days of our fathers to this day, we have been in great guilt, and for our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hands of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as at this day. Even though they've got a temple again, and even though they've got the Torah, They are not free. They are bondsmen to Persia. And so, and Ezra realizes this is a just punishment, and that we have got to start keeping our covenant with Yahweh. So now we go to the book of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2 again show us his trust and devotion. Now, men from Judah come to Nehemiah, who's in Persia, and he asks them, how are things going with the exiles, those who've gone back to Jerusalem? And they're like, it's going terrible, because Jerusalem has no wall anymore. There's nobody to protect them, right? The temple has been rebuilt, but there's no wall to protect that temple. And so Nehemiah starts fasting and praying, and he confesses his own sins and the sins of Israel. And he asks Yahweh for mercy and for success, because he knows that there's something that he's got to do. He right now is not absolutely sure, but he knows he needs to go to Jerusalem, and he needs to assess what needs to be done. And it really weighs heavily on him. It weighs so heavily that he tells us that he is the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes notes how sad he looks. And he asks him, what's up? And Nehemiah tells him, my kinsmen that are back in Jerusalem, and my own kin who are actually buried there, their sepulchres are being put in danger, because there's nothing to protect them. There's no walls around Jerusalem. And the king asks him, what do you want to do? And Nehemiah tells him, I want to go back there. And so the king says, well, make a timetable for when you'll return, but you have my support. And again, you have gold, you have silver, you have anything that I can find that was stolen from there to take with you. And I'll even send soldiers to protect you. And so Nehemiah heads off to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, he decides to go out at night. He's not told anybody what he intends to do. In fact, he hasn't assessed the situation now. And it's a dangerous place, right? There are all these foreign people who are suspect of Israelites who are coming back. A temple's been rebuilt. You've got Ezra, who's reintroducing this law to them and telling them to cast off their foreign wives. And so Nehemiah, in the dark of the night, goes out to inspect the walls on his beast. And Gustave Doré, the artist, makes it a very beautiful Arabian pony that he goes to inspect the walls. And what does he find? He finds the gates burned down. He finds great big holes in the defenses. And he sees that what he's going to have to do is rebuild them. But we're told that the foreigners, and in particular Sanballat the Horamite, and that his good friend Tobiah the Amorite, are very, very unhappy with this rebuilding of the walls, right? And we heard the letter that got written to Artaxerxes, and then the letter that comes back from Artaxerxes saying, you stay out of their way. Cyrus sent him back. We found his decree. They can rebuild the walls. And but they still are coming up against this foreign resistance. They start getting the walls rebuilt because they work as a team, right? Oh, people just look out, and they're in these small groups, and they're like, oh, look at the wall around my house. And they rebuild it from one place to another. And they start rebuilding the gates, right? The king of Tyre again is supplying wood to them, and They're getting stone, they're bringing it in, they're rebuilding these walls bit by bit in different groups. Nehemiah is a great planner. He's divided the people up. They've each got their section. But then they find out that the foreign powers are trying to stop them. And they're terrified, right? There are still Israelites living outside of Jerusalem in the smaller cities, and they're living amongst these foreigners. And they know that Sanballat is plotting against them, and that they're actually planning to come in and forcefully stop them from building the walls. And I love this line from Nehemiah. He says, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your homes," right? He is the Tom Brady of Jerusalem. He is this team builder. And he comes up with a plan, right? He puts people, armed guards, in the low spots of the wall. And he tells his workers, you work with one hand, you keep a weapon in the other hand. And listen, if somebody does attack, blow the trumpets. All of us will come to the assistance wherever that attack is made. Well, the foreign powers back away, right? They, much to their disgust, they realize that Nehemiah has the upper hand. And so they continue the work on the wall, and Nehemiah has to rein in the rich. He's got people coming to him and wives coming to him who are Israelites. And the Israelites still have to pay taxes to Persia. And so they're being taxed. And when they get low on funds, they go to their own brethren to ask for loans. And the rich Jews are charging them interest. So, and when they can't pay up the interest and pay back their loans, they're taking their vineyards, they're taking their farmland, they're taking their houses. And so all these people come to Nehemiah and tell him what's happening. And of course, in the Torah, not allowed. You can't charge interest to your brother when you make him a loan. And Nehemiah goes to the wealthy people among the Israelites, and he explains to them that he and his friends are actually giving money to these poor people to pay back the loans, and that they should fear God like he fears God. He doesn't charge interest on the money he gives them, right? Because it's against the law. And the rich people realize what they've done is wrong. They promise to give back the vineyards, the lands, and to stop charging interest. And you realize the real holiness of this governor, Nehemiah. He points out to the rich that he is allowed by the king of Persia to go out amongst his own people and charge them for his food allowance. But he doesn't do that. And he's not buying up all their land. When they get in trouble and they need money, he doesn't go buy their land. And in fact, at his own table, he's supplying his own food, and he's not only feeding himself and his family, but 150 other people too every night. And there's a great story about him refusing to sin by hiding in the temple when his life is threatened. He is not a Levite. He is not from Aaron's family. And so he can't go in the temple. And what has happened is that, again, it's Sanballat, the Horamite, and Tobiah, the Amorite, who are trying to get him to come out from inside of Jerusalem, right? He's protected in Jerusalem now by the walls that they've rebuilt. And they're like, hey, we're going to write a letter to the king, and we need you to come in here out to us and talk to us so that we can get this letter right. And really they're setting the trap for him, which he realizes, and he won't go out to them. And so what they do is they hire a priest within Jerusalem, within the temple, to try to convince Nehemiah to come and hide in the temple because these foreigners are going to come and kill him. And he sees the writing on the wall, and he's a devout man, right? He knows the rules. He can't go in and hide in the Holy of Holies in the temple. There are places restricted that he can't go beyond because he's not a Levite, and he is not from the line of Aaron. And so he refuses to do it. A very holy man. So the wall is finished, but Nehemiah still realizes that Jerusalem is vulnerable. They've got protection, but they have very few people, and they're very widely dispersed within, and they've not built their own homes yet. So they're really kind of out in the open, you know, probably living in tents and soft things that can be attacked very easily. And so he's very careful about when are the gates open, what time of day are they opened, when are they closed, who comes in, who goes out, right? So in chapters 8 through 10, we go back to Ezra, and it's kind of a retelling of the story of Ezra reading the law to the people, only now with much more detail and with Nehemiah included in it. Ezra reads from the book of the law of Moses, and it says that the Levites help the people to understand it. That's part of the result of this exile, right? When everybody lived in the chosen land and everybody in Judah and Israel spoke Hebrew, and that's what all of the books of the Torah are written in, is Hebrew. But once they got pushed out into Babylon, remember they were there for 70 years in Babylon, and in Assyria for at least a century more than that. And out there, what they spoke was Aramaic. And so these generations have lost their ability to understand Hebrew, except for those who normally read and take care of the holy books, who are the Levites and the priests. And so they go out to the commoners who speak Aramaic, and they translate the Hebrew into Aramaic so they can understand it. And when the people understand how they have not been following the law, they weep. And they're told, no, don't weep. This is a day to be joyful, because now you understand the law. Now you can walk away from sin. This is a holy day and a joyful day to the Lord. So they read from it, and they celebrate the Feast of Booths, which we're also told about back in the book of Ezra. And then Ezra essentially prays salvation history to, again, make the Israelites understand how merciful God is and how sinful the people he made his covenant with are. That God has held up his side of the covenant, but it's the people themselves who have not. And he goes back to Abraham, right, in Ur, and he talks about Abraham's faithfulness to God. And then he talks about Moses and how Moses led them out of the promised land through the splitting of the Red Sea, but how they rebelled, how they made a golden calf. And then he talks about coming into the chosen land. And he talks about setting up the judges, and all the time that he's explaining this, he's explaining how the 12 tribes did not live up to their side of the covenant. And then he has the scribes write out a new covenant. And he says, everybody's going to sign this, right? And there's a summary of what's in this new covenant and of all the people who come to sign it. And There's no foreign wives, right? Because again, not because God doesn't like foreigners, it's because he needs them to worship him alone. He's making a hole for his son to come to. He needs somebody who understands how he has prepared it, the history behind salvation. And these foreign wives have proven in the past to not be good. And this morning it came up, but aren't some foreigners, if they actually become Jewish, if they actually worship Yahweh the way he's supposed to, isn't that okay? And we've seen that happen, right? Rahab the harlot, back in Jericho, she shows up in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. We have Ruth the Moabite, right? Love when we're doing our little review, how Ruth ends up marrying Boaz, and they have Obed, and Obed has Jesse, and Jesse has David, and David's line will lead to Jesus Christ. It can happen, but 99.9% of the time, as Israel has proved over and over again, the wives don't convert. They bring instead their foreign gods in, and the husbands end up worshiping foreign gods and the children. So, no foreign wives. Keep holy the Sabbath day, right? Every 7 years, let the land rest and forgive debts. These are all things that were already in the laws that were given to Moses. Pay a yearly temple tax, because somebody has to pay for all these calves and sheep and cereal and oils and incense. And so everybody goes and they actually sign now a new covenant. They don't just cheer it, yeah, we'll do it, amen. No, they sign their family's name that they will keep their covenant with God. And so now we've got a temple. In 515 it was finished in Jerusalem. We've got a wall. We've got the Torah, the law that's been reintroduced, and the people have embraced it and they've signed a new covenant. But still, when you read Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 36, behold, we are slaves this day in the land that you, God, gave to our fathers to enjoy its fruit and its good gifts. Behold, we are slaves. There's still something missing. In chapters 11 through 13, the last chapters of Nehemiah, again, we get a long list of families that have come. And as I said, the chronicler, the one who took the memoirs of Ezra and Nehemiah and worked them into the books of the Bible, he is very interested in genealogy and in keeping the tribes of the 12 tribes pure. And so he goes through a genealogy. We're told about the joyful dedication of the wall around Jerusalem, and the dancing on top of it, the cymbals and harps and trumpets blaring, and just the pure joy that we are home, we are protected. He works out a system for paying all of the people who work for the temple, including the singers and gatekeepers and Levites, and we read about the Ammonites and Moabites being banned from any association with the assembly of Israel. And it goes right back to something that we had read about many weeks before, about Balaam. Remember Balaam? He was a prophet that was hired by the Ammonites and Moabites to go and curse Israel. And he was riding on a donkey, and he was going to go curse them, but every time he opened his mouth, he ended up blessing them instead. And he started whacking his donkey, and his donkey starts talking. And but I mean, that was why they did this ban here centuries later, on the Ammonites and Moabites? Well, because they hired Balaam all that time ago. So they banned them. And then we're told that Nehemiah evicts Tobiah from the temple court, where you get the idea that there were lots of people within the 12 tribes that liked Tobiah the Ammonite. It sounds like he was kind of a wheeler dealer with them, that he had gained their respect in ways, and that there was a priest within the temple that decided in one of the courts to make an apartment for Tobiah. So he clears out the cereal offerings and all the different items for the temple from this room, and he makes it into an apartment for Tobiah. Well, and he does that while Nehemiah, remember Nehemiah made an agreement with the king of Persia that he would come back at times. And so he was back there with the king. And when he finally gets back to Jerusalem, he kicks Tobiah out. He finds out from the Levites and all the different people who serve at the temple that they hadn't been paid. And so they had left the temple. So he gets them paid and gets them back. And he tries to clean up the act of Israel again. Because what are they doing? They're not keeping the holy day holy. On the Sabbath, they're doing things like people from Tyre are bringing in fish to sell. And there are mounds of grains it's a shopping day, right? Everybody's shopping on the Sabbath instead of praising God and giving glory to God and resting. And so he closes up the gates and doesn't allow any type of trade to go on the Sabbath, or wine making. That was another thing that he saw. They were out stomping the grapes on the Sabbath. And once again, he condemns marriage to foreigners. And as he does, it's interesting as this very holy, devout man goes about being a peacekeeper, being a uniter of people. Whenever he does something, he oftentimes says, "Remember me, oh my God, not for my iniquities, but for the good that I'm doing right now." And that's a prayer we should all pray to God. Remember me not for my iniquities, but for the good that I try to do. So that's the end of Nehemiah. But the conundrum of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? We just read about the temple being rebuilt, Ezra bringing the law back to it, Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. But there's still a problem, right? We were told in Jeremiah that a new covenant is going to be written on Israel's heart. And each will know the Lord, because the Lord will forgive their sins. But the restored temple wall, the Torah, has not done this. It's not brought communion with God. Yes, they have signed a piece of paper that has the covenant written on it, but he's not living inside of them. They are not feeling this communion that they had hoped to feel. There's something missing. The prophet Zechariah says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Behold, your king comes to you, humble and riding on a donkey." But they don't have a king. All right, Nehemiah was appointed the governor. When they were rebuilding the temple, there was an Israelite who was made governor. But governors are not kings. They serve the king of another country. They're still kingless servants of Persia. The prophet Malachi prophesies that in every place license is offered to my name, in every place incense is offered to my name and a pure offering. And he also prophesies that the Lord will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. But there is no pure offering. There is no Elijah. There is no glory of the Lord. Israel and the world are awaiting Jesus Christ in the fullness of time. That pure offering that's made every single Sunday at our churches is the pure offering of the Eucharist, right? Jesus comes at the Last Supper and he changes bread and wine into his body and blood, soul and divinity. There's the pure offering. He's the one who's going to ride humble on a donkey back into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, right? John the Baptist is going to be Elijah the prophet who's going to be there for Jesus Christ, who's going to be there to usher him in, to make straight the roads, to bring the mountains down and fill up the valleys and make a way for the Lord. All of these things are awaiting Jesus Christ. So Ezra and Nehemiah, they and Zerubbabel have rebuilt the temple. They brought the Torah back, and they built the walls of Jerusalem. But the glory of God is waiting, and it's going to wait a while longer. We have one more book that we're going to read in the Old Testament, First Maccabees. But we're not going to do it next week because there's no class. It's Ash Wednesday. And if you are under the age of 60, Ash Wednesday means it's a day of fasting and abstinence. So no meat, that's the abstinent part. And the fasting part is that there's no snacking in between meals. And your large meal of the day has to be smaller than the sum of the two other meals. I find that to be a very difficult thing to do. Oftentimes on Ash Wednesday, I'll just do a full fast because it's just too hard for me to figure out the other. But and I don't have to do it because I'm over the age of 60. But I find it to really help me spiritually. So I still do. And even if you still abstinence, the no meat part holds for all ages. So when we come back on the 24th of February, hopefully a much warmer time, it'll be First Maccabees chapters 1 through 16. And may this Lent bring us all very special blessings as we begin it next Wednesday. So I will stop my share and say goodnight and wish you all the blessings of our great God.